Welcome to the July 11th, 2019 edition of the Smart Energy Decisions webinar series. I'm Deborah Channel, Research and Content Director at Smart Energy Decisions. This series has been developed to deliver insights and useful information for executives at large electric power users. We focus on best practices in energy management and renewable energy sourcing. Today's edition, sponsored by NRG Energy, is titled Integration Innovation, the Benefits of Distributed Energy Resources for Your Business. Our presenters from NRG are Doug Sansom, Fazil Sheikh, and Kathleen Colbert. This panel of experts will discuss how the evolution of DERs is creating opportunities and bringing customers greater control of their energy supply. We'll conclude with the opportunity for our audience to ask questions of the panel. First, a couple of housekeeping details. Please enable pop-ups within your browser and turn on your system's sound so you can hear the streaming presentation. If you'd like to ask a question, please submit it at any time during the webinar on your console. We'll do our best to answer all audience questions either during the Q&A period at the end or following the webinar. If you need any technical assistance, please click the help link or submit a question, and we'll respond right away. We are extremely grateful for the growing engagement of our community at Smart Energy Decisions. Our mission is straightforward. We're here to help large power users to improve their profits and reduce their carbon emissions by adopting best practices in energy efficiency and renewable energy sourcing. This ongoing webinar series is one of many programs and services we produce in fulfillment of that mission. Our next event is a third Renewable Energy Sourcing Forum in September. The forum will provide ideas, connections, and solutions necessary to create and execute a successful RE sourcing strategy. Today's webinar, sponsored by NRG Energy, is titled Integration Innovation, the Benefits of Distributed Energy Resources for Your Business. Our presenters from NRG Energy are Doug Sansom, Director of National Accounts and Wholesale Origination, Fazil Sheikh, Director of Procurement for Distributed Energy Resources, and Kathleen Colbert, Regulatory Compliance Manager, Distributed Energy Resources. We have a lot to cover today, so Doug, please get us started.
Thank you. So everybody, this is our safe harbor agreement, and it's pretty straightforward. You've seen these things before, I'm sure. It's important to note here that this information is provided for informational purposes only. Obviously, we'll answer as many questions as we can today in this limited time. But if you have other follow-up questions, please reach out to Smart Energy Decisions, and they'll certainly get a hold of us. Next slide, please. We have three topics today. Kathleen Colbert is going to talk about the history of DERs. Fazil Sheikh is going to talk about actions businesses can take now with respect to DERs. And I'm going to lead off with the evolution of distributed energy resources. Oh, it looks like we have a poll question for the audience. Deborah, can you explain how the poll works to everybody?
Sure can. All right, we're going to advance to that slide. And the first question, we want to get an idea from our audience. How would you describe the priority level for resiliency of electric power at your facility? So you see three choices, high, medium, or low. Click on the most appropriate response for your company, and we'll give everybody a moment. And while you're answering that question, let me remind you to submit your questions at any time during the presentation. Just type them into your console so that we can see them. All right, let's take a look.
Okay.
Hi. Okay, so 50% say high, followed by about 38% at low and almost 13% at medium. Doug, you want to take it back? Let us know what you think.
Wow. Well, this sounds like this topic's very relevant for about 80% of the people, which is great. So we're moving on here. I think I've got the next slide, slide 12. Initially, standalone assets were locally operated, and we called those distributed energy resources. And today, things have changed fairly significantly in that we often have multiple assets at a location that involve very intricate software, sometimes even artificial intelligence, and these tend to be remotely operated in accordance with business rules designed to achieve the business goals at that location. So there's a lot of ways to use these assets to leverage electricity markets and make money in the markets, either by bringing capacity to the market or reducing capacity at the location. Obviously, can gain greater control over local energy costs, particularly during peak periods. And of course, there's always the reliability resiliency opportunity to assure electric supply during power outages. There are many commonly employed DERs. I'm sure everybody on this call is very familiar with these. You've got renewable energy, of course, which is wind and solar, or even geothermal. Fossil fuel generators, which could either be natural gas or diesel. Obviously, CHP is there. Hydrogen fuel cells are relatively new on the scene. Battery energy storage has become much more popular with the reduction of the cost of lithium and building those batteries. And, of course, demand response. NRG Energy's Curtailment Solutions team out of Buffalo, New York, currently controls about 3 gigawatts of demand response assets throughout various markets, such as Ontario, PJM, NYISO, ERCOT, CAISO, and, of course, ISO New England. There are many benefits for DERs. Here's a couple obvious ones on the page. Renewables, for example, if they are renewable assets being used as distributed energy resources, these are obviously a clean source of fuel, and that there's limited, if not zero, carbon footprint as they produce the fuel, as they produce the energy, I should say, at the site. They also can be great value-added resources, and they're mostly flexible when they are paired with a storage, so that you can actually extend the use of these sources of energy into times when wind doesn't blow or the sun's not shining. Fossil fuel generators, of course, have been around for a long time. Reciprocating engines are proven, although in today's environment across the U.S., depending upon local state requirements, some restrictions may apply to those types of sources. Demand response tends to be very low cost with a high value added type of DER. It doesn't take a lot to get involved in demand response except a commitment to reduce load at the site during particular times during events. Of course, this means that demand response has to fit with business objectives and goals. And then finally, there's microgrids. Microgrids tend to be integrated solutions, and they provide maximum flexibility for bringing together lots of these different resources. So you could have renewables on site as well as fossil fuel generators and even participate in demand response programs, all part of the same microgrid, which gives a tremendous amount of flexibility. The value added, though, of a microgrid from a resiliency or reliability perspective are often very hard to calculate. So as you can see, there's really no one best way to deploy a distributed energy resource at a location. It really gets down to business objectives and the overall goals of the location, what they're trying to achieve. The rise of distributed energy resources have been significant. In just the last 9 years, DERs worldwide have grown significantly, above $650 billion US at a combined annual rate of growth, I should say, of 15.9%. Microgrids have actually grown faster, from $4 billion in 2018 to $30 billion worldwide, and that's about a 25% compounded annual rate of growth. So that's fairly significant. And why is that? What's really driving all this? Well, it's down here in the lower right-hand corner. Significant number of power interruptions in 2015 alone cost the United States economy $44 billion. Some of these power interruptions, you may recall, actually had names associated with them. Things like, I don't know, Harvey, for example, in Texas, or Hurricane Irma. Hurricane Maria in 2017 was very significant. In fact, if we look at just the past 8 years, there have been 4 major hurricane events just in the United States, which resulted in 5.4 billion megawatt hours. 5.4 gigawatt hours, not billion megawatt, but 5.4 gigawatt hours of lost electricity supply. So what is really happening here is we're seeing that the centralized grid is being transformed. Customers and utilities are deploying DERs and microgrids, often on their own, to harden the critical infrastructure and to achieve goals that are very important to them. We see several trends in the market today. Specifically, NRG Energy sees decentralization of the grid, decarbonization of the grid, and data-enabled grid infrastructure as being 3 major trends that are being driven by these 3 events. Outage risks are growing, continuous power is becoming more essential for businesses, and finally, energy markets are getting much more complex. Next up in our presentation is Kathleen Colbert. So Kathleen, I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you, Doug. This is Kathleen Colbert, again, Regulatory Compliance Manager with the Distributed Energy Resources. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the distributed energy resources from a regulatory perspective, as well as kind of touch on some market trends. Before I get started, we have another poll, so I'd like to ping back to Deborah for some help.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. Our second question asks, how often have you experienced outages in the past 2 years? Never for some lucky people, 1 to 2 times, 3 to 4 times, or 5 or more times. So select the answer that best corresponds to your business. And while we're waiting for people to click in, let me remind you again to submit questions that we can answer after the presentation. All right, and let's take a look at the responses. Okay, so the most 55% at 1 to 2 times, nobody at more than 5 times, 30% at 3 to 4, and those lucky 15% are never. Kathleen, back to you.
Thank you, Deborah. These are interesting results. I completely agree with the lucky 13 or so percent that have never had an outage or in a good camp. This isn't all that surprising. We engage with a lot of customers that are looking for solutions to help ensure continued service at their sites. And while that definitely is very focused on what is the value add for customers, I'm going to pivot a little bit towards the history of regulatory, the evolution of some regulations that have created an environment that really has allowed for this opportunity to even be feasible. So first, I want to talk about some major federal regulatory changes that were made between 1970 until now. And like the way that I think about it is it really has created the environment by which all of the ability to serve these business needs can thrive. So the first regulation I want to talk about is the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act of 1978. There's a couple important pieces of legislation that came out during that year. This was under the Carter administration, which was very focused on conservation and what the value of conservation could bring to the overall U.S. economy. The Public Utilities Regulatory Policies Act, that's an important piece of legislation to set us up right for this environment because it ensured the market, that there would be market and fair rates for electric power and steam produced by small power plants, such as combined heat and power plants. It really created a wedge that opened up competition within the vertically integrated utility model. This piece of legislation allowed for non-utility generators to produce power for use by customers that were on the distribution system. This really broke that monopoly structure that we had historically seen. The second thing it did is it created qualifying facilities, so the treatment of combined heat and power plants under special rate and regulatory treatment that would allow them to operate more seamlessly. And then finally, it added some favorable treatment for renewables, which started to incentivize investment in renewables. Moving from PURPA, which I'll use the acronym if that's all right, but moving from PURPA to the 1990s. The next one that we want to talk about is the Energy Policy Act of 1992. The reason that this is important is that it allowed for some open access on transmission lines for wholesale customers and created another new class of generators that could continue to compete with utilities in building power plants. There's a common theme here of how do we increase competition, setting up rules that would allow for competition with utilities. The new class of generators were exempt wholesale generators that could generate power any way they saw fit without regard to energy efficiency concerns, as was the case for PURPA QF. So it gave some additional flexibility for these exempt generators. It did also within the Energy Policy Act of 1992, and what I think are two of the most important things of this legislation is it provided for a permanent extension of the investment tax credit for solar and geothermals. And I'm going to go into more detail later on the next slide about what investment tax credit, or also known as the ITCs. The other thing that the Energy Policy Act of 92 did is it established the production tax credit that was really focused on incentivizing investment in wind technologies. The next piece of legislation I'm going to segue to is in 1996. In 1996, FERC took an action to allow open access to transmission service. This is in order to make a comparable playing field for these non-utility generators and the utility generators to be able to provide wholesale services to customers. This was done through Order 888. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in 96 required vertically integrated utilities provide universal access to their transmission systems, what we generally colloquially refer to as open access. FERC's goal here was to remove the impediments to competition in the wholesale bulk power marketplace to bring more efficient, lower cost power to the nation's electricity consumers. What FERC was doing is it was requiring all these utilities that own transmission facilities to file an open access, non-discriminatory transmission tariff. We frequently call that an OAT, so an open access transmission tariff. That would contain minimum terms and conditions of non-discriminatory service that customers and non-utility generators could be able to utilize in their businesses. Now that we've kind of touched on, okay, we have renewable incentives, we have some open access, we have increased competition, the next big piece is that FERC Order 2000, which occurred in 1999. This mandated the creation of competitive wholesale markets, and it mandated forming a regional transmission organization or an independent system operator. FERC required all utilities to file with FERC a proposal either for a regional transmission organization, RTO for short, or alternatively, a description of any efforts made by the utility to participate in an RTO that had already been established. Utilities could also explain reasons for not participating and any obstacles to that participation. And that's how we've ended up with the national landscape that we have with ISO RTOs, which we would consider in a deregulated environment, versus more of the vertically integrated utility models still present elsewhere in more of a regulated regulated market structure. Next, I want to delve in a little bit more detail onto the federal incentives for the distributed energy resources. I mentioned that the Energy Policy Act of 1992 initiated the production tax credits that we largely think of as being available for wind. Interestingly, it made permanent the investment tax credit. That investment tax credit was originally created back in 1978 under an Energy Policy Act. So it was established kind of in that first wave with PURPA, right, to incentivize renewables. But in 92, what they really said is, okay, this is important. We're going to make this permanent out the curve for a certain amount. On this slide here, my takeaway that I'm hoping to bring to the audience is that if you look at the two tables here, you have the production tax credit and the investment tax credit. The production tax credit's on the left, and the investment tax credit is shown on the right. When I say that it made the Energy Policy Act of 92 made it permanent, what I'm really referring to is the very bottom of this table, when it describes eligible technologies and the credit rate, as well as the expiration date, you'll see that for solar and geothermal, a credit rate, so a tax credit of 10% of the basis of that cost of that investment is made permanent under that. So out at any new construction for solar or geothermal will still be eligible to claim this tax credit out into perpetuity, unless, of course, the tax laws are amended. Under current rules, this is what is in place. When you look at the production tax credit on the left, in the left table, this is expiring at the end of 2019. What that functionally means is that the production tax credit will only be available based on current legislation up to 2029 for wind facilities that began construction no later than 2019. The condition is you have to begin construction before the tax code rules expire, so that's 2019, but you're eligible to claim that for up to 10 years. So that's why in practice, this can extend up to 2029, where these tax credits for both wind and solar would still be eligible. There are other technology types. So when we think about these, we generally think of solar and wind, and yes, they are the asset types that we've seen the most penetration of based on these different incentives that have been made available, but there's also fuel cells, microturbines, CHPs, that are eligible for these tax credits under this. So there's a strong benefit of looking into some of the details if you're interested in other technology types. Before moving on, I do want to note that the PTC is expiring, and it doesn't seem like there's going to be any regulatory effort to try and extend it, whereas that has happened 11 times since it was initiated back in 1992. 6 of the 11 times it was actually allowed to expire and then retroactively put in place. What's interesting here from a policy perspective is that even the Association for Wind Energy, AWEA, is not advocating publicly to extend the production tax credit for wind. When you look into some of the policy narrative, it's because the policymakers are shifting from being interested in establishing these resource-specific tax credits towards considering whether a direct tax on pollutions or emissions, such as a carbon tax, would be a more appropriate policy solution. Carbon taxes are technology neutral, so you don't have to define the specific resource type, and it really targets the problem that's trying to be solved while giving more flexibility for developers and R&D to figure out the best solution to solve that problem. So I think from a regulatory perspective, that's where we see the winds changing. Moving and kind of transitioning from a federal perspective towards a state perspective, because there's both federal and state incentives for DER to help create this landscape where it's really ripe for growth. On a state level, what we're seeing is the growth of clean energy standards. On the slide that I'm presenting, I'm showing a map that was put together and pulled from the Desire database sponsored by North Carolina State University The Desire database is a database for state incentives for renewable energy. And they've put together this visualization across the nation of these different clean energy standards. This map shows by state whether or not there's a renewable portfolio standard in dark blue. The light blue refers to renewable portfolio goal. The difference between a standard and a goal is a standard is a mandate, whereas a goal may say, like for example, North Dakota is 10% by 2015. North Dakota publicly stated that is their goal, but they're not mandating utilities to go out and meet that, at least not at this point. So when you're looking at that, that's essentially what you're starting to see. Some states have mandated standards. If you don't comply with them, you get hit with a penalty equivalent. If in other states are kind of setting up, here's where we want to see things go. Can we do it? In green, you're looking at a clean energy standard or a clean energy goal in light green. The way that I kind of think about the difference between these is renewable portfolio standards generally truly only include resource types that are under the renewable definition. Clean energy standards might be a little bit more flexible. They might have different types of assets that are, it might include a zero emission credit component, right? That's more targeting nuclear technology. So you have to dig into the details, but under all four of these, there's going to be the eligibility for renewables in order to comply with these goals. I'm going to highlight on the next slide a clean energy standard in Pennsylvania that also incorporates demand side management. And so that one is a very interesting state policy to look at to see how it's trying to incentivize more DER penetration. Before I move off of this, talking about just the span, I do want to drive home that what we're seeing is that there are 29 states and the District of Columbia, so let's say 30, that have a renewable portfolio standard, and 3 states that have a clean energy standard. There are 8 states that have a renewable portfolio goal and 2 states that have a clean energy goal. That is 42 states. The majority of the United States have some kind of goal driving either the utilities to have a requirement to go out and source a certain portion of their retail sales from renewable or clean energy, or a direction through these goals that are more voluntary. But that is across the majority of the United States. So we see this as a trend that is definitely not stopping, it's growing. Next, I'm going to delve in a little deeper and give you an example. The standards kind of set up the legislative framework. Okay, go out and make this happen. Once that happens, then the public utility commissions have to then work with the utilities to figure out what's the right way to make these things happen. So from a renewable portfolio standard and a clean energy standard perspective, what we're seeing is state policies are incentivizing low carbon emitting assets regardless of their technology type. There's a vast array of technology types, and I can provide some examples through a renewable energy credit, a zero emission credit, or even what's called an alternative energy credit. To keep it simple, they're kind of all the same thing. They're energy certificates that can be used to show compliance with one of these standards. And I'll give you 2 examples. The first I want to talk through briefly New York's program, so New York's Renewable Energy Standard, and then Pennsylvania's Alternative Energy Credit. For New York, what is a REC? So a REC is a certificate that corresponds to a specific attribute. These are environmental attributes or technology attributes of energy produced from qualifying resources under their program that can be used to track the utility's progress towards and compliance with the state standards. Under the New York program, so the New York State Energy Research and Development Agency, also called NYSERDA, administers the New York Renewable Energy Standard Program. In their administration, in collaboration with the PUCs, what they have established is there's a certain amount of resources that they consider eligible if if those resource types are generating, to be able to have the megawatts associated with that generation count towards a REC. The resources that New York considers eligible span from biogas, biomass, liquid biofuel, fuel cells, hydro, solar, tidal ocean, and wind. A wider range of resources that fit underneath this renewable bucket. The utilities are then, the generators can offer that into the REC procurement process once based on the amount of generation that's provided. And the load serving entity or the utility has to acquire a certain amount of RECs in order to match what their obligation is under these standards. What I think is also helpful to drive home the distinction between the standard and the goal is that if the utility doesn't do that, they have to go out and then pay for an alternative compliance payment. If you don't get enough generation to back your retail sales to be in compliance with these standards, you're going to have to pay some kind of penalty for it. So on the right here, where it says RES 2018 compliance to your resources, this is showing NYSERDA's report on the prices associated with utilities being able to comply. You can look at that on the flip side of that coin, is that's the prices that were paid to the generation for helping them meet that compliance. For 2019, the renewable energy credit sale price was roughly $22 per megawatt hour. When the next, and that's 3 down, so it goes from 2017, 2018, 2019. And then the 2019 ACP price, that's what I'm referring to, that alternative compliance payment. If the utility doesn't go and procure enough RECs to meet their compliance at $22 per megawatt hour, they're going to have to make that up with an ACP, and that'll cost them about $24, $25 per megawatt hour. It's a little bit more expensive. It kind of creates that incentive, go out, get the generation, pay that to the generation to incentivize the right generation to meet the standard that the state wants to see in their system. Next, I'm going to give an example of Pennsylvania. Essentially, everything that I talked about with the RECs and how it works is basically the same. Where you see differences is kind of how the standards themselves are set up to incentivize certain resource types. That's very state specific. In Pennsylvania, it is a little bit broader, and it also includes a demand side management aspect. So Pennsylvania breaks their standard into Tier 1 and Tier 2, where Tier 1 is kind of your more conventional REC, what you would see in New York's REC program, solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, fuel cells, biomass. Tier 2 includes a different set of resources. So it includes waste coal, distributed generation systems, demand side management, large scale hydro, municipal solid waste, even the ability to comply through procuring through the CHPs that are processing, that are creating generation as a result of the byproduct of their wood manufacturing or pulping processes. So that kind of all falls within this Tier 2. From a DER perspective, this is Pennsylvania standards help incentivize that DERs and demand side management have clear value in meeting the clean energy goals. The distributed generation systems that are eligible are small scale, generate electricity, or use thermal energy, such as CHPs. For demand side management, the utilities are able to comply with this requirement through incentivizing energy efficiency, demand response. And so the Pennsylvania standard is, and this falls more, in my opinion, under kind of a clean energy or an alternative energy. So it's not strictly renewable, it's looking at a more creative mix of resources that can drive lower emissions to meet the state standards. From a pricing perspective, I thought this one's also interesting because the value associated with the different tiers are pretty drastic. I'll also note that under Tier 1, solar has a specific requirement. It's pretty small. The requirement itself is only about 16% of all retail sales in the state. For solar, the weighted average credit price, and again, a credit represents 1 megawatt hour, is about $55 per megawatt hour. For tier 1, that full array of renewables, it's about $12 per megawatt hour. When you start talking about tier 2, you're dropping down to about 16 cents per megawatt hour. So the value of these more complex, creative, these other resources under the AEPS program is lower, but the requirement is still in place, and the utilities will still need to procure about 8% of the retail sales off of those. From an alternative compliance perspective, Pennsylvania has a much harder compliance requirement if you fail to meet that. The cost of the ACP is $45 per credit or per megawatt hour. Next, I want to build off of that. Okay, so we're kind of creating this framework where you have all these federal policies that incentivize investment, state policies that are incentivizing investment, as well as production, what they want to see actually net metering and then providing this additional generation. So that's the next piece of this puzzle, right? You can have that generation on the system, whether it's front of the meter or behind the meter, but it needs to be connected to the system so that it can export that energy and meet these needs that are being required under these statutes. So this map is showing the net metering policies across all of the states in the U.S. The reason I want to show this is that from a distributed energy resource perspective, whether or not the value proposition is there in order to, and where to decide where to install certain resource types in the United States, the net metering is an important part of that puzzle. When you look at this map, you can see that a lot of states do have some kind of program, but these programs, they vary greatly by state. But even within state, each utility files their own net metering rider, which can have its own compensation model that would be then approved by its state regulatory body. So the net metering policies are very different across the United States. In the darker green, the states that have a dark green represent where there's net metering that is paid at the full retail rate. The next, kind of moving down the gradients, the next one represents a retail rate at first, but then the credits kind of expire over time. So I would think of that as the highest level is incentivizing production out the curve. The next level is really incentivizing installing the assets in the beginning, but not continuing to produce indefinitely. Moving down, we then get to the next level, which is net metering that is only compensated at a retail rate. Only compensated at less than the retail rate. So when you're looking at this, you can start to think about the different value propositions. Moving off of that, we then look at if there's distributed energy resources are able to value stack through dual participation in the wholesale and retail markets, either as a generation resource or as a demand response resource. This chart shows that there is about 16% of PJM's demand response market that is made up of behind the meter generation. Next, I want to give a very brief overview of kind of where some pricing trends are. Now that you have a basis on the regulatory evolution. Wholesale across this chart shows New York ISO, MISO, PJM, and ISO New England. These are the wholesale capacity prices from 2017 and 2018 that provide signals as to locations where there is a need for additional generation. As you can see, New York is fairly high. PJM and ISO New England about in the same relative order, but MISO has a very low capacity value. Next, in addition to the capacity prices, we're going to look at the wholesale energy prices to increase that value proposition for participating in the daily markets. So bidding into an ISO and RTO on a daily basis. The wholesale energy prices are increasing, so they've increased on average from 2017 to 2018. This increasing price trend indicates that there is a potential for DER to capture positive revenues from daily wholesale participation. At this time, that completes my presentation on the history of DERs and the trends that we're seeing in the wholesale market. And I'd like to invite my colleague Fazil to step in now for what action businesses can take.
Thanks, Kathleen. So the prior speaker spoke to the market and as well as the different types of DERs in the market, fuel cells, CHP, solar, et cetera. So, sorry, let me just adjust my phone. So, the way I think most organizations look at these different things is ultimately, which solution is going to help me meet my business objective or help solve for my pain point, either for your organization or a facility or a group of facilities. We're going to spend the next couple of slides talking about a solution that's focused on driving down energy cost and can also provide reliability. I think the next slide, if we can advance, is going to take us to a poll. So I'll hand it off for that.
Okay, and I'll take that over. Thanks, Fazil. So for our final poll question, we're asking, have you experienced long-duration outages within the last 2 years? A simple yes or no. Again, any long-duration outages within the last 2 years? And while you're answering that, one last call for questions that you can submit through the console that we'll get to at the end of the presentation. All right, let's see what the poll tells us. Wow, okay. 45% of our listeners have experienced long-duration outages. 55% have not. Fazil, back to you.
Thanks. So getting into the solution that we'll spend a few minutes talking about before we get to questions, there's obviously a lot going on in the slide, but essentially with a product we call asset-backed demand response, we're providing customers an opportunity to have a guaranteed outcome on their total energy expenditure for a respective site or group of sites. And as part of that, we can provide reliability. So the way in which we do that is we will look at the profile or the load profile and the energy usage at a site, both power and gas. And we'll look at, what kind of financial outcome could be achieved by installing a on-site generation system. So, in the case of this product, it would be a natural gas-fired genset behind the meter, appropriately permitted and installed. And we would basically determine, a guaranteed financial outcome for total energy expenditure for a customer. If the customer can or needs reliability, then we can also look at layering in reliability into the solution. So NRG will basically fund, own, install, operate, and maintain the system. So this is behind the meter, parallel interconnected. The facility does not know, whether it's receiving power from the utility or if the system is online and generating power. So a little bit different than CHP, not creating steam. This is primarily or based solely just creating energy for the site. So the way in which this works is that NRG, by virtue of installing the asset and operating it, whether it be for market events or demand response or pricing, we're able to achieve a financial outcome to pay for the system and recoup our investment and provide the value we represented with the customer. can move to the next slide. So it's a little bit different concept where, I think other DERs are providing more of a singular capability or solution. A storage asset may be focused on just helping reduce demand charges, whereas this is focused on, again, guaranteeing the outcome of your total energy expenditure. So we'll give some examples here in a few minutes, but part of what happens with this sort of product is that the power and gas commodity and delivery and utility cost and invoices and coordination, those are managed by NRG under this product. And NRG, in turn, pays those, manages them, pays those, and then invoices the customer monthly for a set cost. So not any changing rates, and it's a set cost for the duration of the term. We can go to the next slide. So bring it together, we'll go through a few examples. This was a manufacturer in New Jersey. The baseline total energy cost was about $260,000, and they had a peak demand of just shy of 6 megawatts. We looked at their profile, what they spend, and we looked at installing two 2-megawatt natural gas units. And again, NRG paid for them, installed, own, operate, maintain. And as part of that, we were able to provide the customer with the guaranteed total cost energy for 10 years at a discount of what they were paying by 8 to 10%. So this customer was looking for an economic outcome guaranteed, and we were able to provide that at a 10%, nearly a 10% discount to what they had been paying. So you can see how in this example, customers electing to hand off the energy management almost entirely to NRG and focus on operating their business and their core business. Can go to the next slide. So in this example, we're again in New Jersey. Customers' base annual total energy expenditure was about $139,000. Their peak demand was 2.4 megawatts. This customer was looking for reliability. They were affected by a storm, and they had the option to spend their own capital to install some on-site reliability solutions, most likely diesel. And the package that we were able to put forward was two 1.4 megawatt gas units, and as well as a 900 kW diesel. That's really only run, the diesels only run when there's a localized issue or outage. And again, NRG was able to provide that, no capital out of pocket to the customer, guarantee their energy cost for 10 years with the 6% reduction, and as part of that, provide the backup power. Go to the next slide, please. A little bit different application or vertical. This was a data center in Virginia, Greenfield, brand new facility being built, and they were looking at about 50 to 60 megawatts of generation for their facility. And the path that they chose to go down is one where we would install 60 megawatts of engines. And when that plant was completed and constructed, NRG would purchase it from them, and they would have a guaranteed energy spend for the term, and have the assets there for reliability purposes. So in this example, when we acquired the assets, they would be able to redeploy that capital elsewhere. I think that concludes the slides and just a brief overview of the solution. I think we'll go to Q&A.
That's great. Thank you so much, Basil, and thank you, Doug and Kathleen, for your presentations. So let's start with the first question we have up. What challenges and potential solutions do you see for storage in the near term? Kathleen, why don't you take that one for us?
Thanks, Deborah. So challenges and solutions that we see for storage, correct? Yes, in the near term. Well, honestly, storage is really interesting right now. Storage is a big priority on the market level. So FERC released a new order in the last year or so called Order 841 that requires all of the independent system operators and regional transmission organizations that I was talking about to implement a participation model that will allow energy storage to actively bid into the wholesale markets as a generating resource and receive comparable treatment and be able to capture the value of its flexibility within the whole, both from a capacity as well as on an energy and ancillary service level. So what we're seeing here is the challenges include the market operators don't necessarily know exactly how to make the rules in a way that storage can do that without hurting the equipment. So we really need to be cognizant of the physical limitations of the storage, making sure those are respected so that the assets can stay online as long as possible while they're participating.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen, for that one. And moving on to our next question. What is the interest of C&I users to combine multiple objectives for their DER projects? For instance, cost savings, autonomy, and GHG reduction. Doug, can you answer that one for us?
Sure. Thanks. Great question. Often customers are looking to justify the value of the distributed energy resource they're putting behind their meter. The company, for example, may have sustainability objectives to reduce greenhouse gases, and at the same time, they also want to reduce the cost of their energy. So one way to do that is to shave peak loads during peak periods so that they can hit coincident peaks in their market. This works very well in places like Ontario, where they have a global adjustment incentive program, as well as a lot of the other ISOs that we work in, like PJM and NYISO and so on. So putting a distributed energy resource asset behind their meter that could do both suddenly helps the company justify the expense and the overall value proposition for the asset. So putting, say, a battery energy storage solution behind their meter might achieve both objectives. It really gets down to what does the company view as important, and and is there something, I should say, that they can put in place that will allow them to achieve reliability standards, reduce cost, or sustainability, and often they can find overlaps there with the right assets and with the right solution. I hope that answers the question. Back to you.
Great, thank you. And we'll move on to the next one. What type of natural gas generators were used in the North Virginia data center example? Were they fast start? Fazil, that one goes to you.
Yeah, thank you. In that example, there were natural gas lean burn units. Understand from the question with respect to fast start, there is obviously with data centers that need to switch power sources from utility to backup very quickly. So in what we're finding in certain cases and with certain developers or data center operators is that the gas units do take a little bit longer to get up and running and switch power over. But the UPS systems were something that in this situation or instance, the operator was the customer was willing to lean on a little bit longer. We do believe that faster starting gas units are coming down the pipe, but I think that basically answers the question.
Okay, Fazil, thank you. And we are running out of time, but I'm going to get one more in here. Can partners work with NRG to provide these services to their customers? Doug, that one's for you.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. In fact, NRG solicits partners. We're always interested in new technology, proven technology, different ways to approach solutions, and so we're always looking for partners. If there are channel partners out there with either technology or sales expertise or deployment expertise like EPCs, please reach out to me, Doug Sansom. You can reach me at my email and some of the contact information you'll see here at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Doug. I wish we could go on, but I think we are just about out of time. So let me end by thanking the NRG panel. Doug, Kathleen, Fazil, great job, great presentation. I know your insights have given our audience a lot to think about. So thank you to NRG Energy for making this webinar possible. We appreciate their time and effort. And finally, I'd like to remind you all to tune into our next webinar on July 25th. Thank you all for listening. Enjoy the rest of your day.